While there are many kinds of lens filters available for the Luna Ultra, if I could only carry one type, it would have to be ND filters. They may look like a fairly simple accessory, but they fundamentally change the way movement is rendered in your footage. Used in the right situations, they can make shots feel smoother, more natural, and more cinematic in a way that's extremely difficult to replicate in post. And because of the way the Luna Ultra is stabilized, it's especially well suited to taking advantage of them, a point I'll come back to later. So in this video, I'm going to explain why you might want to use ND filters in the first place, when they're actually worth using, and how to use them specifically with the Luna Ultra. And if you are looking to buy a set, I'll finish with some important things to consider before choosing one. So if you're wondering why you would use ND filters in the first place, the simple answer is motion blur. Video is essentially a series of still frames played back in rapid succession. When every frame is extremely sharp, movement can look harsh or choppy. A natural amount of motion blur in each frame helps bridge the movement from one frame to the next, making it feel smoother and more fluid when played back. It's also how motion is commonly rendered in movies and high-end TV productions, which is why we tend to associate it with a more cinematic look. In order to achieve that blur, you need to use a slower shutter speed and allow each frame to record movement over a longer period of time. The problem is that a slower shutter speed also lets more light into the camera. So unless you're filming at night or somewhere fairly dark, your image will quickly become overexposed. And this is where neutral density filters come in. They essentially act like sunglasses for the camera, reducing the amount of light reaching the sensor so you can use a slower shutter speed without blowing out the image. Now, I often get comments asking if motion blur can simply be added in post. And while there are tools that try to simulate it, the results just don't look as natural as real motion blur and can introduce some very obvious artifacts. I can understand faking motion blur on electronically stabilized cameras, because on those, slower shutter speeds can cause jittering and smearing in your footage. But the Luna Ultra really is built for ND filters. It uses a mechanical gimbal rather than electronic stabilization, so you can shoot at slower shutter speeds and get clean, natural motion blur without running into any of that. So to sum up, an ND filter is simply a tool for controlling exposure. It doesn't create motion blur by itself, but it gives you the freedom to use slower shutter speeds in lighting conditions that would otherwise overexpose your footage. So now that we know what ND filters are for, the next question is, when should you actually use them? Of course, if you've already decided that you want motion blur, the answer is straightforward. Use an ND filter whenever you need one to keep your exposure under control. But what I actually want to talk about is when you might want motion blur in the first place, because while a lot of people rave about it, it definitely isn't essential for every type of footage. Even on this channel, where I talk about ND filters all the time, I usually don't bother with them for product reviews or talking head shots. They add another step to the shooting process, and for everyday content, I often prefer a more casual and conventional vlogging style over something that feels deliberately cinematic. When I'm traveling, however, I usually want to come home with footage that I can turn into something more filmic. So in those situations, I often do use ND filters because natural motion blur is an important part of achieving that look. Ultimately, using an ND filter is a creative choice. Whether it improves your footage is subjective and depends entirely on the style you're trying to create. And finally, motion blur also unlocks some specific creative techniques like whip pan transitions between scenes or seamless wipes that use the blur to disguise the cut. These aren't techniques I use particularly often, but they're an example of motion blur being used as a practical tool and not just for the look. Now that we know what ND filters are for, let's go through a practical demonstration of how to use them with the Luna Ultra. Before I even touch anything, the first thing I need to do is choose what shutter speed to shoot at, because that's exactly why we even have these ND filters. For a natural looking amount of motion blur, we can follow the 180-degree shutter rule, which means setting the shutter speed to roughly double the frame rate. At 24 FPS, that's 1/50th of a second, and at 30 fps that's 1/60th of a second. Since I'm shooting this video at 30 fps, I'll swipe in from the right of the screen, open the exposure settings, and lock the shutter speed to 1/60. And as expected, the image is now heavily overexposed, so it's time to add an ND filter. Because it's a bright day but I'm not in direct sunlight here, I'm going to try the ND32. As you can see, the exposure is much better now. In softer light, a weaker filter like the ND16 may be more appropriate, while if I were shooting out in full sun, the ND64 might be a better choice. You can leave ISO on auto, as I have here, or set it manually. There are quite a few technical considerations here, so I'll include a fuller explanation in the description. Unfortunately, the Luna Ultra currently lacks a live EV readout, so you have to judge exposure by eye. You don't need to get things absolutely perfect, since there is room for adjustment in post, but having a live EV value like the one on the DJI Osmo Pocket would remove a lot of the guesswork and make it much easier to expose consistently between different scenes. So I'm really hoping Insta360 has this in the future, along with some way to see what ISO the camera is using when auto ISO is enabled. One final thing to remember is that the 180-degree rule is only a guideline and doesn't need to be followed strictly. Faster shutter speeds produce sharper, more staccato movement, while slower speeds create a dreamier, more heavily blurred look, so you can adjust it depending on the effect you want. So hopefully you now have a solid idea of what ND filters are for and how to use them. To finish, let's go through a few things to consider when choosing a set for your Luna Ultra. So far, I've tested this set that Freewell kindly sent me for review, as well as these official Insta360 filters which I bought myself. And honestly, from an image quality standpoint, I couldn't see any meaningful difference between them. Neither set introduced a noticeable color cast, even with the strongest ND64 filters. They're very similar in most other respects too, both have a groove on the side to make them easier to remove, both let the gimbal close with a filter attached, and both fit into the storage slots on the camera's protective cover. So the main difference is the number and selection of filters you get. The Insta360 set includes ND4, 16 and 64 filters, giving you 3 in total. The Freewell set includes ND8, 16, 32 and 64 filters, giving you 4. Now, I haven't been using ND filters with the Luna Ultra for very long, so I can't yet say which combination will suit my shooting best. But so far, I'm leaning towards Freewell selection being the more useful of the two, if following the 180 shutter rule. Since it's summer, the ND64 has been absolutely essential on really sunny days. But the ND32 has been equally useful, since it often lets me use a more suitable ISO than either the ND16 or 64 in the outdoor lighting I encounter most often. For that reason, I can understand why several third-party brands have decided to include the ND32 filter in their sets. As for the weaker ND4 and ND8 filters, I haven't had to use them yet, but they may come in handy on darker overcast days or certain indoor situations. Finally, everything I've shown so far have been fixed ND filters, but variable ND filters are another option worth considering. These let you adjust the strength by rotating a dial, so you don't need to carry several filters or swap them as often. However, because they work by stacking 2 polarizing layers, they can introduce polarization artifacts and are more prone to noticeable color shifts compared to fixed ND filters. The ones I've seen for the Luna Ultra also mostly only cover ND2 to 32, so they still wouldn't give me enough strength for sunny conditions. For those reasons, I personally think fixed ND filters are the better starting point. So are ND filters an essential Luna Ultra accessory? Not really, because it depends on what you shoot and how. But if a more cinematic and polished look is something you want, even if it's just occasionally, they're definitely worth keeping around. They can look complicated or impractical at first, but with time, using them becomes second nature. For now, I'm just hoping Insta360 can give us some updates that improves the experience of working with them, as there's still much more guesswork than there needs to be.